So tempers flared yesterday evening at the Women and Equality Select Committee when Labour MP Kate Osborne accused Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch of likening children and young people coming out as trans to the spread of disease. Badenoch countered this accusation by insisting that Osborne was lying in what became a rather heated exchange. The Equalities Minister had told the committee that laws needed to be modified in order to protect single-sex spaces, and she believes that male predators were exploiting legislation loopholes in order to gain access to areas such as women's lavatories and changing facilities. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now by diversity and inclusion facilitator Katy Jon Went. Katy, thank you very much for joining me. Isn't this a problem for people who have genuinely transitioned, that there are men who will take advantage of loopholes in the law? And that's just human nature.
Yes, but I mean, I've just come through Paddington Station and you only have to walk into the toilets there with a high-vis jacket and a mop to take advantage of the possibilities of accessing certain spaces. So I think people who have malicious intent will always find a way. Generally speaking, people who are at risk of abuse are at greater risk staying in their own home and not leaving their house. We know that for a fact. But if you want to get into the language of who is genuinely trans or who genuinely transitions, I think the Equality Act isn't entirely clear on that. It kind of describes transitioning rather than having arrived. And if we how does one define being genuine and having arrived, whether it's the possession of a gender recognition certificate, which is a bit of old law, which relatively speaking, I would say might need some updates, and also still creates the situation with when and where can you ask to see someone's GRC? And is that the paper equivalent of asking to see someone's genitals? How do you inspect and police something as vague as who is genuinely trans?
But this is important because we've always lived in a society in this country where you don't have to show your papers. And I would hate to see a society where we had identity cards and you had to show your papers to go to the loo. That would be pretty ridiculous. But you also need to have some understanding of what is genuine and what is not, and that the ability, if the law provides it, for people to pretend is actually harmful to those who have genuinely decided to make what must be a very difficult decision.
And it is a difficult decision. I made it, and it was a struggle, and it was very much for myself a kind of last resort, which is actually some of the words that Kemi used, describing transition for many. It should be available, and for many, though, it should be perhaps a last resort. I think you've got a dilemma because, as you say, we shouldn't get to the situation where we have to produce ID cards to gain access to anything. That said, to travel, one needs a passport. Passports come in two flavours, male and female, except for the countries that allow the third option. We don't. It gets continually kind of asked for here and never gets any further, usually championed by the Lib Dems. But it's not something that you can do, bring up a passport or a driving licence or a gender recognition certificate at a doorway to access a particular service. And my neighbour and friend Linda Bellos is very hot on the Equality Act, and she, as a lesbian woman, regularly gets kind of challenged on her gender almost, because if we're doing it based on who looks like what, it's based on kind of gender and beauty standards on who looks typically male, who looks typically female. And at the end of the day, do we really want to be confronting people like that? When you talk about fraud, when you talk about people kind of with malicious intent, the dressing up, if you want to call it that, I'm not saying that's what trans people are doing, but if you're going to call something dressing up as the act of error in itself, as opposed to the act that you do after you've dressed up, the real fraud is not the fraud itself, but the act afterwards. Well, and that's what we should be policing without policing appearance.
Yes, but how do you get to this? Because I know you'll say hard cases make bad law, but when you get sex offenders who, in the process of being convicted, suddenly say that they are not a man who has carried out a rape, but they are in fact a woman, so they can go to a woman's prison. This is not something that the state could possibly go along with, is it?
And we've already changed that. I've actually spent quite a lot of time working extensively with the prison service over the years, from before there was ever a prison service instruction on trans. I was never working with it in a trans capacity, but I was working with them in a different capacity, but actually was transitioning whilst working with them. So they used to regularly ask me, Katy, can you give us some off-the-cuff advice about what do we do with our trans prisoners? We're currently doing this. Each individual prison had their own policy, and some were acting on what you might call common sense. if you put the person who, committed a, financial fraud, who's fully transitioned, transfer them to a female prison or a female wing, it's not going to cause too much of a rumpus. But if anyone with a sexual violence history, anyone who hasn't bodily transitioned, that is now the current policy again. It's taken a long time to get back to common sense.
But that's really important, because it seems to me that there is a good deal of common ground, that it's based on what is somebody really doing, but therefore you need to make inquiries, and that the extremists in the trans debate actually do harm to people in your position. They make it harder for you by saying that if tomorrow you decide you are of different sex, everyone must accept that. That clearly can't be the law, can it?
Well, anytime you shut down debate, I believe you're already losing your argument. That doesn't mean debate should take place with venom. I think being able to humanise the person you're debating with or discussing with or trying to change law with, whether that's across the benches kind of politically, whether it's across the barricades between trans and gender critical, whether it's Israel and Gaza, whatever it is, you have to be able to humanise the person that disagrees with you if you yourself want to be humanised and understood. And that means talking. I get into a lot of trouble because I choose to talk with those who might disagree with me. And only if we talk can we actually create consensus, coexistence, and ways to navigate society where we get on with it. We create society not by making everyone the same or making everyone agree, but by coming up with consensuses and coexistence that enable different faiths, different viewpoints to cohabit together.
I've always thought it comes down to the individual. Thank you very much.